desire for revenge. And the Germans detached these provinces, Alsace-Lorraine, from France and took them. And that's we have here, you know, take territory when you win wars. As if it's a Jewish concept. Anyway, they took Alsace-Lorraine, and then through the First World War and the Second, it was all fought over again, back and forth, back and forth. Finally, Alsace-Lorraine is back in French hands because the Germans lost the First and Second World Wars. But a lot of antagonism over those issues. Well, the French army was in turmoil. And then in the 1890s, there was some spying going on. Naturally, there would be in all countries. And a spy was discovered on the general's staff, at least the traces of a spy. And so a trail was left by the investigating body to point at Dreyfus, the only Jewish person on the general's staff. And they had a trial, and they forged evidence, and they convicted him. He writes it in his autobiography here. And they had a public, when a person is taken out of the army, what's it called?
Court-martial.
More than that, when they actually do it physically in public, when they pull off his epaulets and his buttons and all that. You have the right word, what'd you call it?
Discharge.
No, not discharge. It's a kind of humiliation. I forget what the word is, an actual technical term that is used. It's a result of a court-martial, but it's not the court-martial. The court-martial's already taken place. It's a, I forget what the word is. I'm sure in Google it you can find it, or in the thesaurus you can find it. And Herzl, Theodor Herzl, was the assimilated Jewish newspaper correspondent from one of the very best Austrian newspapers, who covered the trial and the public disgrace, or whatever I think that you refer to it as, humiliation or disgrace, degradation I think it's called. I think it was called I think it's called degradation is the word, public degradation of Dreyfus. And he watched it as the correspondent, and up to that time he'd been basically a dandy, if you want, a assimilated person, and he'd been a belles lettres, someone who liked to write essays. He had flirted with playwriting. He had even written a novel or so. Someone who wanted to do writing and be an artist, and he made his living as a newspaper correspondent and so on. And then he says in the Zionism book, I can show it to you. Way ahead of myself, so I shouldn't have done it in this order, but this is what happens when you're not very organized like me. He says, 1895, I have been occupied for some time past with a work which is of immeasurable greatness. This is in his diary. Shavuot, 1895. This is Dreyfus is humiliated, degraded in the beginning of January 1895. This is in June 1895. I cannot tell today whether I shall bring it to a close. It has the appearance of a gigantic dream. But for days and weeks it has filled me, saturated even my subconsciousness. It accompanies me wherever I go, broods over my ordinary daily converse, looks over my shoulder at my petty comical journalistic work, disturbs me and intoxicates me. What it will lead to, it is impossible to surmise, but my experience tells me that it is something marvelous, even as a dream, and that I should write it down. And then he goes back to his writer self, if not as a memorial for mankind, then for my own delight or meditation in later years. Anyway, the dream, or what has taken hold of him, is this Jewish state idea. When he finally publishes it, it's called Judenstaat. things published around not long after. He has the prestige to get things published. We're going to look at that later. But Herzl is there, and he says he's possessed. Well, when he saw the thing, he says elsewhere, and he ran home when he heard the cries of the mob and the joy the street mob took in the degradation of Dreyfus, that he realized that assimilation was impossible in Europe. He realized that assimilation was impossible in Europe. And the only hope for the Jewish people was a state of their own. This is what he's saying is this fantastic dream. Now we're going to get the forerunners to this, but that is the background to Herzl's own, and he was gripped by this. He was worked like one possessed. He died in 1904. As a very young man, I think he was only 44 years old. He just worked himself to death over this for 9 years. He got very little thanks from his opponents among the Jews, who mocked him because he was not religious, who mocked him because he was secular, who said, oh, we're going to accept this Moses character coming to us from the West. We'll read how they laugh at him in Chaim Weizmann's writings and some of the other people's writings. But Herzl becomes the titanic figure, actually, primarily because of what transpired. If, in fact, what transpired is not transpired, I guess we would say it was only a romantic idea. But he becomes a titanic figure because when you read his work, and we will read it, you see that he knows something terrible is in store for the Jewish people, and very soon he understands that intuitively. And the reason he understands it is he lives in the West. He lives in Vienna and Berlin and Paris and London. He knows the West. The masses of Eastern Europe are living in a fog. They have no idea what's coming down the highway towards them. They have no understanding and couldn't possibly foresee what he, living out like Plato's cave out in the light, can see. And he has the influence and the insight to do something about it, or to try to do something about it. So he does work as one possessed, and we will discuss that again in the future. But before I finish up today, I want to go to Zola's defense of Dreyfus. Look at that piece here. But to finish up, the greatness of Herzl, as we, I think, can and will see.